Hello everybody, I am Dr. Karin Mackay and I am a lecturer and researcher from Western Sydney University in Australia. My area of interest is in arts and cultural wellbeing. I have been developing a model of cultural wellbeing through my academic and community arts work over the past 15 years. In this presentation, I will introduce this cultural wellbeing model, which has emerged from my research work in 4 community-based projects. I will also consider several other kinds of wellbeing and how the implementation of cultural wellbeing has come about. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners from wherever you are in the world listening to this presentation. For me, it is the Darug Nation in Australia, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners past, present and emerging. Since the cultural wellbeing model that I will be discussing includes acknowledging a person's past, present and future through the ancient practice of storytelling, it would be remiss of me not to give a brief outline of my trajectory here before I start. Besides my teaching degree, health studies, community arts development work and my cultural studies doctorate, my lived experiences form a really important part of my work in wellbeing. I grew up in a working class family who valued money over the arts or higher education. My first job was actually as a bank clerk, and I became a bank manager at 21 years old. I found that the values of greed as good in the 80s did not sit well with me, and I could not continue in this role. Instead, I saved my money, and then I spent 2 years backpacking through South America and Africa, and I worked in London to support myself. I had a near-death experience in Salvador in Brazil from becoming very sick, and it changed my life trajectory forever. I witnessed just how privileged I was, and so I spent a lot of the next part of my life working in community. I also spent the next 20 years of my life married with a family. I grew up from a very young age without a mother, so when I had my own children, I had to learn through experience and didn't have a great deal of maternal support. I have 4 amazing children now, over 19, 3 of whom live with me due to the COVID pressures. I support them financially on my own. I have lived experience of mental health issues, both at a personal level and with close family members. Collectively, these experiences have informed my approach to cultural wellbeing. I currently work at Western Sydney University and I am a cultural studies scholar. I have a teaching degree that I earned in 1999, and I have also completed studies in health science at the University of New England in Australia. In 2004, I began using art in community childbirth education classes, and I was also a doula, which is a woman that supports other women when they're in labour, if they don't have support or if they want extra support. I also began women's expressive art classes, exhibitions and festivals to create a space for support, women's voice, and a sense of connection and community, which focused on wellbeing. That went for about 10 years. In that time, I also became an artist, and I curated festivals and exhibitions for the women's groups that I was working with. I have an interest and have for a long time in how community arts and creative cultural practices are vital for individual and collective well-being, from ancient and to contemporary times. In 2015, I became a lecturer, researcher in creativity and cultural wellbeing at Western Sydney as a tenured academic. Since 2015, I've worked with a range of diverse communities using arts in cultural wellbeing, particularly with refugees and migrants in Western Sydney in Australia. Some of the organisations I've worked with are Sydwest Multicultural Services, Cultural Resource Migrant Centre and Multicultural New South Wales. In 2019, I worked with the New South Wales Coordinator General of Refugee Resettlement with distinguished Professor Peter Shergold and the peak body Multicultural New South Wales for Refugee Resettlement. In the future, currently I am working with the Victoria and Albert Museum with Dr. Gus Casely-Hereford on documenting stories of home with African Australian diaspora in Australia in a really exciting film project. So these perspectives have really galvanised my understandings of lived wellbeing, and that's what we'll be discussing today in this presentation. So I'd like you to take a moment right now to think, well, what is it that you think of when you think of health and well-being for yourself or your family? Is it good physical health, being at peace, feeling good within yourself, having a safe place to live? Is it about being able to call on family and friends? In this time where we've been, as a global community, completely turned upside down by world events in terms of our health, it is really important to look at a whole range of perspectives on what it means to live well on our planet. And that's what my presentation will consider. There's much we know about well-being from a physical and psychological perspective. Cultural aspects of well-being have only recently begun to be seriously included in the well-being conversation. It's a really important step to include culture in well-being because it demonstrates the interconnected nature of well-being. And really, it's only since about 2002 that this has been in the academic literature, probably even a little bit later than that. The work that I want to focus on in this presentation is how a cultural wellbeing approach is not only an individual pursuit, but something that affects whole communities. And I want to focus on how this cultural wellbeing approach can help us move towards a paradigm shift of the use of our language and the way we live, which is inclusive of individual wellbeing, but also looks at community cultural wellbeing and even beyond that. So just to remind us that the World Health Organization's inclusion of well-being has always been there from its inception. However, as you would know if you're a health and well-being scholar, that the definition is health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. We all know now that this definition is not necessarily inclusive of an array of states of health and well-being, and the word complete is difficult because we can still live life with significant meaning if we don't have complete physical, mental and social well-being. So that's just a reminder of where we started with global health and well-being. We are bombarded in our daily lives on our social media, positive messages of how to be happy, how to flourish, how to maintain well-being, how to get there, and here's two examples here. There has been a prolific seeking of positive messages from the wellbeing industry, and it's really understandable why we want these messages. But some now call this a toxic positivity. And while it's meant to be encouraging these messages, it's also problematic because it sets unrealistic expectations that if you only think positively, everything will be okay. Even though I subscribe to some of this, I really think critically we need to rethink what well-being includes, not just the positive aspects, the growth aspects, but as I will elucidate in this presentation, aspects of breakdown and aspects of structural power and those imbalances. When life circumstances are not supportive through either economic circumstance, being born in a country at war, happiness posters are not going to get you to a state of well-being. So, what is the progression of well-being and international concepts of well-being? Particularly, I've looked at this through the lens of cultural well-being. So right back in 1994, New Zealand Maori concepts of well-being were being talked about in the academic and economic literature. In 2002, the United Kingdom local councils introduced concepts of cultural well-being as well. Not particularly well defined, but still talking about the value of culture to well-being. In 2002, a huge leap forward happened in New Zealand where local authorities actually wrote about cultural well-being being arts, culture, heritage and identity, and those kind of aspects of well-being being really critical to include. Interestingly, in Australia, which is where I'm from, we had a living standards framework that was driven by economic Treasury Department in 2004, didn't particularly mention cultural well-being. The Finnish Arts and Culture for Wellbeing policy in 2004 is still seen as one that is very progressive. However, it comes from the education and outdoors field rather than from an economics perspective and rather from necessarily a cultural studies perspective. So a little bit different. In 2010, the UK had started to measure national wellbeing, starting to really gain momentum here. And in 2017, Germany developed a 12 dimensions of wellbeing, which was quite forward-thinking as well. Even before 2017, the OECD did have a living standards framework. However, as it is now, it was developed in 2017. Once again, all of these frameworks tended to be focused in, most of them, on an economic rationalist perspective, which was aiming, how do we measure this cultural value? There was a slightly different perspective coming from Australia in a framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' mental health and social and emotional wellbeing, which looked more at connection and connectedness. Now, the most current and probably well-developed, I would say, cultural wellbeing framework at the moment, I feel, currently comes from New Zealand, and they have incorporated a living standards framework into their gross domestic product, into their actual policy documents. It is an economic rationalist perspective, and that's something that we'll discuss a little bit further, but that's just a little bit of background on where the wellbeing frameworks have come from and their progression. While there's a great deal of perspectives on well-being, I'm going to start talking about well-being in terms of cultural well-being that was first mentioned in the literature in 1994. That's not to say that these concepts haven't been in communities for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the first mention academically is in 1994, and we can see here the Maori concept of well-being. The Maori concept of well-being includes spiritual well-being, physical well-being, mental and emotional well-being, and social well-being. And it uses the form of a house because that is considered to be a sacred space. The Wahanu Ora approach is sourced from Jury, and if you want to read more about that approach, you can. What's important about the Maori concept of well-being here is that it draws upon intergenerational well-being, not just well-being of an individual in a particular place and time. It looks at the lineage, the culture, the heritage, the arts as being really important in concepts of well-being. I've included the OECD Wellbeing Framework here to highlight how well-being is conceived and valued. So if you look down the bottom, it has resources for future well-being, and it includes natural capital, economic capital, human capital, and social capital. It doesn't necessarily include cultural capital. It doesn't have a space there for creative, it doesn't have a space for spiritual capital, and so on. So it is still not including cultural capital in terms of heritage, identity, sense of belonging, and so on. It's really more talking about capital in terms of resources. So New Zealand has developed a living standards framework led by Dalziel, and this includes 12 domains of well-beings and also a capitals approach. Importantly, what you can notice here is that what has been included is cultural identity in one of the 12 domains, which is quite different to some of the other wellbeing models that we've seen. The other thing that you can notice if you look at the cultural capital for future wellbeing, the term culture is embedded within each of the 4 strands. So you have natural cultural capital, social cultural capital, human cultural capital, economic cultural capital. So this is quite a leap forward in terms of understanding that heritage, identity, artistic and cultural vibrancy are something that are really important to measure for well-being. Here's another wellbeing framework. This one was developed by the Australian Capital Territory Government in 2020 through quite extensive consultations within the community. There are 12 domains again. If you have a look at those, they are really more concerned with, I suppose, domains or things rather than cultural capital or cultural vibrancy. So it has here identity and belonging, which is something that has been included that may not have been included previous to the New Zealand model, which is interesting. It also has one which is called access and connectivity, which is something a little bit different as well. So what we've seen in some of the models that we've looked at previously is the focus has been on measurable attributes or measurable domains, including that of culture. This model is a smaller version, I suppose, but it has been developed from an Aboriginal Australian community that was looking into suicides in communities, was looking at how can we empower communities. What you'll notice in this particular aspect of well-being is it talks about connection. Connection is basically central to every part of the sense of well-being. And you'll also notice that down the bottom it says historical determinants. That's really important distinction between a lot of the other well-being models which look at the future and the present, but not the past, not the intergenerational trauma, except for the Maori model of well-being, which looked at intergenerational ownership of land. So my question is now, looking at the models of well-being that have been presented in this presentation so far, is do they represent the world that we're living in now? How are we measuring well-being? Is that the way that we need to be considering well-being? The Director General of the WHO has really put out a call to say that our cataclysmic world events in the past 2 years are a huge reminder to us that we are dependent upon systems that go beyond just human systems. He says that the pandemic is a reminder of the intimate and delicate relationship between people and planet. Any efforts to make our world safer are doomed to fail unless they address the critical interface between people and pathogens and the existential threat of climate change that is making our Earth less habitable. The point being made here is that I'm questioning whether or not our well-being models are actually fit for purpose, and do we need to rethink them? According to Tedros, we may actually need to think differently if we are going to live well in the coming decades. Our well-being models have primarily been dominated by a neoliberal growth model, and Ross Gittins, a leading economist, has commented that our leading thinkers around the world are really grappling with why is the economic system that we have put in place over many decades haven't really helped as many people as they should have, and in fact in a lot of instances have made our life worse. So we need to question, is the neoliberal approach to well-being, is that working for us? Is it enough? The capital's approach to well-being is one that measures well-being in units and gives it a value. Two well-regarded economists, Smith and Gleason, have critiqued the capital's approach and suggest that this is not the way we should be discussing well-being. In fact, Gleason has mentioned that she feels the term capital is too small for us. It's too small for all that we are as humans and the Earth's living systems. So we need a new way to think about well-being. So if we need a paradigm shift, what are some of the problems with the current well-being models that are out there? From my extensive reading and study of this area, as well as my work in practice-based community projects over the last 15 years, this is what I would like to add to the conversation. So the problem with current well-being models is that the well-being is based on arbitrarily assigned units of measurements that are disconnected from the lived reality. So we talk about cultural well-being as having an assigned value. It's, as Smith said, it's very difficult to assign a value to loneliness as a unit. So perhaps this way of talking about well-being and measuring well-being is not really measuring what we think it is. Another issue that I have noticed in my lived experience work is that well-being in many of the models is seen as static rather than something that's changeable. So it's almost as if well-being theorists think, well, you reach a certain stage of growth, or you reach a certain stage of socioeconomic wealth, and you're fine. But what I have seen over and over and again is that well-being is something that is not static. It is changeable. This is also very reflective of the neoliberal kind of focus on well-being, and that it is something that just keeps growing and growing, and we become more knowledgeable, more wise, more this, we get more stuff, a growth model versus a sustainability model. So I think we need to change that up. The third thing here is that in all of those models that we've looked at, every single one of them, none of them talk about the breakdown and destructive forces that are part of life. They're not considered. However, we all know that those things are inevitable in any natural system or cycle. Things break down. Our mental health, we have people have mental health breakdowns. Flowers and trees and so on have certain cycles. Our own life, we have a period of birth, growth, and then aging and breakdown. So why is that not included? Why do we always think it's going to go up? So I think the model that I would like to propose would have something in it about breakdown and destructive forces. Another aspect is this a language issue. So we start talking about capitals, but do we think of things in terms of life-sustaining practices? So it's very human-centric, our models. Our models do not seem to think of life in any other terms other than what resources that nature can give us, or how do we as humans benefit. It's very human-centric. So I would like to change the terminology a little bit, so we're starting to think of things in terms of holistic ways of thinking. So instead of capitals, life-sustaining practices. And I'm sure there's many other problems with the well-being, but these are just some of the things that I have noticed in my research work. Finally, while it is important to still continue measuring ways that people gain financial freedom, have security, we also need to make sure we have another kind of well-being model that helps us with the living of the well-being, not just the measuring of it. One of the things I think we also need to consider is, well, who has the power in deciding what well-being means? So when we have somebody, an economic rationalist, measuring well-being, we're going to get units of production and efficiency measures, and we're going to get those kinds of interventions and levers. When we shift the way we talk about well-being into something that is coming from within an individual or coming from a community and a cultural group and an intergenerational kind of perspective, then what we consider to be well-being and who has the power to define what that is changes radically. So what I'm proposing for questions to be asked about where we go in the next century in terms of our well-being. What is missing? What is needed? Where do you begin? So I think first and foremost, we need a new language and a focus away from capitals to one of mutuality, meaningful connections, with a focus on relationships, not only to other people, but to the place we live, to ourselves, to our planet, to our community, and to beyond that as well. As mentioned, I think we need to reframe what well-being is, instead of thinking of it as something that is static, and understand that it can change radically and quickly. And just because you have a certain level of well-being in a financial sense doesn't mean you're going to have that in other ways. We need a quantum leap in understanding in how life energy works. In other words, things don't always behave with predictability. As mentioned previously, we need to start to incorporate ideas of intergenerational aspects of well-being over time, in different spaces and places. So looking not only that is relevant to Indigenous communities worldwide that have this knowledge, that possibly have passed this knowledge down from generation to generation, but this idea that time, space, place goes beyond just this generation is a really important concept, I think, to incorporate in our bigger frameworks of well-being. I also think we need to look at, if we're talking about cultural well-being, in terms of what is good for ourselves, what is good for our communities, and what is good for our planet, we need to have a conversation about what is the difference between belonging and being part of, and individuation and having your own cultural and critical expression as an individual, and not to just get lost in this concept of cultural well-being, which is something that people might assume is sort of groupthink, group mind. There is this tension that we need to talk about between belonging and individuation. A new paradigm for well-being would recognise that our well-being is dependent on a nexus of relationships and interrelationships between aspects of well-being. And I will talk a little bit more about that when I present the model that I have come up with. But essentially, we understand now, and it is becoming more evident in the research work that I have done, that it's not just about attaining or looking at the discrete elements, the discrete domains of well-being, such as housing and security and economy, or looking at subjective well-being and so on. It is very much about how these move in and out of our lives, and a very small change in one area can impact hugely on another area. There doesn't seem to be any kind of talk or discussion about how that impacts on our lived well-being. So I've just got a little reminder here. The nexus, and what is meant by the nexus, is the point at which elements of our lives converge to create something more than the sum of its parts. So that could be a positive or it could be a negative. And an example of that might be something like that I witnessed in the work with refugee young people, is that when they're trying to resettle in a new place, it's not just about getting them a safe place to live. It's not just about getting them a house to live in. It's not just about them getting into the education system. The one thing that could pull all of that apart is not having transport to get to where they need to go. So it's really important to look at how these things interrelate and interact, rather than just trying to cope with these discrete ideas of what helps people live well-being. So 4 of the case studies that I have drawn on for the model that I am about to present you, the Creative Cultural Wellbeing model, I've just put here. I don't have time, it's beyond the scope of this presentation to go through each of them in detail, but there are 4 quite substantial projects. The first one being on women's wellbeing through story and art, which was part of my doctoral work. Then there was a year-long project, Navigating Resettlement, Creative Media Design with Refugee Youth. Then I had another project with refugee youth, looking at, that was about 400 young people were interviewed about how they resettled into Australia and what things were important. And finally, the Dance for Life project, which was about using expressive arts in regional Australia and how that impacted on wellbeing. So just to reiterate, what is creative and cultural wellbeing, and why am I talking about creative and cultural wellbeing as opposed to capitals? Well, creative and cultural wellbeing aspects are now included in some models of wellbeing, which is fantastic, particularly the New Zealand model by Dalziel et al., which is brilliant work. However, there is a focus on measurement that is in the current literature in terms of policy making. which is, it's good that it is there. However, there is less work going on in terms of developing integrative roadmaps for how to live well in these radically changing times. I feel that we need a new language, and the work that I'm doing is showing me that we're just not capturing the intimate detail of what is going on in people's lives. I feel that a creative cultural wellbeing framework that I am about to open up to discussion for you offers new ways for practitioners and policymakers to talk about the lived experience of wellbeing and how this might be better integrated into wellbeing programs of action. One aspect that I really want to focus attention on, because it is quite the wellbeing model has 12 domains, 12 elements I call them, and but is the creative chaos axis, I think, is something that we really need to think about, and particularly in the last 2 years where we've seen breakdown, we've seen how a pandemic has caused lots of death and destruction, and we can't just pretend we're going to be going in a growth model. So these things need to be acknowledged. So what are the 12 domains that I have? The first one that I've got is being, and what I mean by being is our whole being. So the interplay of inner and outer life, it's the physical being, and it also encompasses our senses of embodiment. The second domain that I have included is mind, which is about the consciousness, intellect, learning, knowledge, and perceived reality. And I have separated it from being because it is something that has huge influence. This would also be where we might start to talk about things like mental illness and so on, if that is the case. Then we have a sense of belonging. Now, belonging is incredibly important to our well-being. But what I mean by belonging is not just the term social connectedness, which is quite popular now. It's also connectedness to things we consider kin across time and across space and place. It's also belonging to people, to nature, our identity. It's also our home and what we consider home, including our physical space, but also our home in terms of we live on planet Earth. That's our home, and we need to start looking at it like that. This is where we would also look at issues of displacement from refugees and migrants and climate refugees, and also networks. Number 4 I've included is love, and I also, if you've noticed, have the word philia, which is an old word which means a reciprocal kind of love. And I don't see love in some of the other models, and I think that's something that is missing from all of the models, except for the Aboriginal model, which talks about caring for country and caring for others, caring for body. We need to instigate that idea of care for other people, but care for the planet and care for our home and where we live. This area is where I would also start to talk about what holds meaning, significance, and value. So when we talk about social connectedness, it's a thing. It's different to belonging and love, which holds meaning and value. It's one thing to be connected. It's another thing to be connected to those things which hold meaning and value. So I think including the term love and care is quite significant. Shared experiences are things that can go from an individual through to a community and a global experience. So things like what we're going through now, this generation, we will have that shared experience. That's quite significant in terms of our well-being and the impacts on that. What are the planetary effects that are affecting us as a generation? It's also about shared culture. It's about shared language. On a positive sense, it's about celebrations and those wonderful things that we share. And rituals that help us to process our lives and make meaning. Number 6, creative cultural practices. These are all of those things that those processes that are life-giving. So, things like creativity, art, culture, museums, galleries and sport, things that dancing, singing, things that we haven't been able to necessarily do, and how important those things are to our well-being, either participating in them or being part of them, or actually making and the doing. That's in a human sense, but also it's talking about the creativity that is there in terms of life processes, animals, the creative processes of earth and how earth is made. So it's not just a human-centric idea. Number 7, time, place and space. This is about nature. This is about environment. This is also about the context that we are in, and that context, be that in terms of a physical place or a time in history, can impact hugely on our well-being. For example, if you were a woman born in the 1700s, your experience of well-being in certain ways is very different to a woman who is born in 2021. So I think we need to look at the context of how we think about well-being and how that impacts, and once again, the intergenerational nature of trauma, but also the intergenerational nature of power and privilege. It's also about the ecology of place. Life-sustaining practices. I have reframed this purposely. Instead of, many of the other wellbeing models talk about work, economies and so on, and yes, that's important, but I really feel that we need to reframe work in terms of what is life-sustaining. Why do people go to work? Well, sometimes they go to work because it gives their life meaning, and that gives them, that sustains them. That's fine. But some people go to work because they just need to put bread on the table and survive. So what we need to rethink what we're doing on our planet. What are the life-sustaining practices? We can't ignore that people need money in this system. But maybe if we want a new paradigm, we need to start to think of our cultural well-being, our well-being in terms of the bigger picture. What are the life-sustaining practices? Okay, and then because I'm a cultural studies scholar, of course I would include power and governance. Many of the well-being models don't really self-critique themselves in terms of who is making the decisions about what well-being means. What does one unit of that human capital, that natural resource capital mean? So I think we need a well-being framework that does include critiques of power and governance. Who is governing? Are we self-governing? Do we have autonomy, agency, power structures, economy? So if we look at all societies, but if we take Aboriginal Australian societies as an example, if we don't include aspects of power and governance, then it's going to be very difficult to address some of the well-being issues. It's one thing to give somebody a house and to help people become self-determining, but if that isn't followed through with real transfer of power, then the cultural well-being, your well-being is not not going to be lived. It's not going to happen. We have one of the really important things that I think we need to include in a wellbeing framework is the idea of breakdown. Life is not sustained forever. We all get to a point where our body starts to break down and we eventually die. And that can be through age, it can be through illness, it can be through disease. And that is the same with plant life, animal life, and so on. So if we're going to have a conversation about cultural well-being and how we're going to live well on this planet, we need to look at what are those things that break other things down, and how do we incorporate that into well-being. When we're measuring well-being from an economic sort of rationalist perspective, there doesn't seem to be any conversations around breakdown. So I am instigating that conversation here. Number 11 is transformation. Now, transformation in ancient societies was very well known. There was a transition between going from a child to an adult, and there would be a transformative kind of ritual that would occur there. We go through transformations, every day, and right now as a society we're going through change, adaptation. Creativity is very important here because the processes and the practices of creativity help us to navigate the transformation that is required from one state to another, and that being through the beginning of life through to birth and living well and death. So we need to include in our well-being how we transform from one state to another. My initial work with women and birthing women, taught me that our society, in Western societies, does not really do well helping people transition from one sort of state to another. And that could be a state of people working full-time to not being able to get a job. So where are the conversations on that? And finally, we're talking about our cultural wellbeing framework for living well. I don't see anywhere in many of the models where life force energy is openly discussed. I mean, we have things that incorporate spirituality, which sort of touches on that. We have aspects of culture. But I think what I'm talking about here is that vital force that animates life from either a sensory perspective or I'm talking a scientific perspective. And I'm also talking very practically here about energy that powers our homes and our cars, and where do we get that from? Where is that life energy? It comes, originally from the sun, but where it may come from deeper as well. But we need a conversation about how we recognize that energy and what we do with it, because we all only get a certain amount of it, and then it has to go back to the earth, if you like. Burning fossil fuels, we only get a certain amount of that energy as well, and for the next generation, what are we going to do about that? So those are the 12 elements that I have proposed. It would be interesting to have your feedback on those and see what you think and see if they work. But this is, like I said, from what I've observed in my work to date. So before we go into the domains, which probably need a lot longer than this presentation to explain fully, I also want to point your attention to the time scale that is on this, being the past, the present, the future. which is a really important inclusion in terms of not just looking at future, not just looking at where we are now, but including that intergenerational aspect. Also, you'll see on the top left-hand corner there is an arrow, and it has individual, community, nation state, planet and cosmos. So the way I have tried to design this framework is that it is applicable not just on an individual level, not just on a human level, but that we can start to look at this in terms of bigger ways of thinking. Because the fact of the matter is that as humans we are part of a bigger system, and so therefore we really need to look at our well-being in terms of that bigger system. So this is the model that I have come up with after looking at those 4 projects over 15 years. Originally, I had many fewer terms in the model, but as I've looked at the other models that are out there and refocused on the work that I've done, I've come up with 12 as well. I call them elements rather than domains. And as you go around this flower looking like structure, you'll notice that the language is a little bit different in terms of what it focuses on. I just wanted to pull this out of the other model. This is basically sits around or on top of the cultural wellbeing framework. I didn't have the design skills to necessarily make it all work in that last slide, but I just wanted to point out that importantly in this framework is the idea that we all have a past. We are all doing the best in the present, and we are all wanting to have a good, hopeful future. And so those 12 elements that I've just talked about, they sit nested within this past, present, future, and that influences how we experience our well-being, our cultural well-being, and experiences how we create ourselves every day in life. And we can do that as an individual, as a community, as a nation, globally, as a planet, and beyond. So now that I've presented the bit of an introduction to the cultural wellbeing framework, I wanted to focus in a little bit, just briefly, on the creative aspect, the creative part of that. And I'm just going to hone in on our stories and our art as being important to well-being and why that's the case. So there's many doorways into the cultural wellbeing framework, and you can enter that into any one of those 12 elements. I'm recommending that we start with something really essential to us, and that is the story of who we are, to understand our own well-being on an individual level to begin with at least, and then collectively we can bring our stories together, and that shows us our community and our cultural well-being. Stories are really important. So stories are important because they show the history and the landscape of our lives. It helps us to know what is there to heal and how can we live well. If it's an unexamined life, very difficult to have what we desire, and that is a sense of well-being. It can unveil trauma, and it can unveil pockets of strength for ourselves and for those others to heal us. Our stories are really important because it acts as a point of intimacy, which I think is very lacking in our current state of the world. Even though we're highly connected, the level of knowing and intimacy is possibly not as much as what some generations previous may have experienced. Stories connect us to ourself. They help us understand in our telling, in our making, and in our performing. It has the power to connect us to ourself, but it also has the power to connect in an intimate way to others. And this telling and this voice is also in itself healing. And this is the kinds of things that I have seen over and over again in those case studies that I mentioned previously with women, refugees, migrants, young people. Stories connect us to place, they connect us to our non-human and our senses. It takes us to another place. It also connects us to the physical of who we are. They conjure emotional memory of places. Stories also, really importantly, I think, and this has been a constant theme, hopefully you're getting in this presentation, is the sense that in well-being there is also breakdown. And in stories, in the story cycle, there is always a breakdown. And the human myth of ancient societies and modern society share this understanding that there is a cycle that is important to us to understand if we're going to understand well-being. Stories show us the moments of collapse. They show us where the slow decline is. And this mirrors the cycles of life and the seasons. And to me, this needs to be integrated much better into our well-being models. So not to labour the point too greatly, but I've shown here 3 different cycles to show you that concepts of well-being and this cyclical nature of well-being that's not static, that is more holistic, they have been around a lot longer than these other well-being, cultural well-being models have been around, and longer than you and I will be around. But it's important to remind ourselves, and it's important to bring these into the conversation of what well-being means. Indigenous societies have a very rich storytelling tradition. Many societies still do. We still do in contemporary world. I mean, you just have to look at a good Netflix show that goes through these stories, and they follow a very similar pattern. Now, Joseph Campbell, if you're familiar with the hero's journey, there is the separation, there's the trials, there's the dark night of the soul, and then there's transformation, and then there's learning, and then there's the return. Highly critiqued, but still, this is the journey of the story, and that's something that we need to sort of be honest with ourselves about, instead of thinking we're going to be able to continually get better. We also need to have periods of rest. We need to understand that there will be periods of backwards motion, but growth through that. But it's not something, life is not something we can sustain indefinitely, and that's something that isn't included in well-being models, and maybe we need to think about that in terms of individuals as well. In my work using creative arts, visual arts, dance, story, with a range of communities, and I lecture this at my university, I've noticed that the creative process of life and an artwork, whatever, has a similar sort of process. So you can see here, there's the think like the earth, I call it creative cycle. It doesn't come from nowhere. It's built on the roots of an idea. And from that, you get an idea, you have a sort of few thoughts come through, you develop an idea or a plan, or you start to actually make that work, that creative work, come into fruition. You have to take risks, there are trials, there are failures, and so on and so forth. And so that, but you start that, and then you get into this process of growth and flow, and eventually, if it doesn't fall off, it does come into this sense of flourishing and blooming and blossoming. But then all good things come to an end, and that particular project or that particular painting or that particular show finishes, and there is a sense of loss after that, and then possibly that will start another process. As you can see, that's very similar to the life cycle of a plant. There is always the breakdown, and the breakdown is needed to release the new seeds. The point of this is that we need to incorporate breakdown into the process of well-being, and one way we can do that is through our creative cultural practices and engaging more vigorously and honouring those much more in terms of our health practitioners, in terms of our lived well-being, in terms of that on an individual level, in terms of that in a community setting, but also in a global process, and understanding that things will break down and that they can be rebuilt, but that we can't just continually sustain the linear trajectory on an upward trend. So this presentation has really had a look at some current models of well-being. I've proposed a change in paradigm in the way we look at cultural well-being, at well-being in general, and introduced the idea of creative cultural well-being. It's a lot to take in a very short space of time. So some of my key points that I will summarise, and if you're interested in this kind of thing, then please contact me. I can be contacted on k.mackay@westernsydney.edu.au, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation whether you agree or not. But some of the key points that I've noticed about this kind of well-being, and how I've noticed well-being working in a very lived experience way, is that well-being is more than the sum of its parts. So it's not just physical, mental, social, cultural, and therefore we can't just atomize it into those parts. We need to see it as a moving system. The nexus points, where things come together and break apart, is where the change occurs in well-being. So a little change in one part of someone's life can have a massive impact, and I don't think that's reflected in our well-being models. Creative expression and creative practice and creative thinking are the way towards well-being, because it is a lived experience and it's based on the past, the present and the future, that continuum. So creative expression is like that story cycle that I showed, and all of those trials and tribulations, and partaking in that kind of process is really important for all of us to understand that there are different parts, cycles and breakdown and beginning again, and not to just expect to reach this peak state of well-being and stay there. Our home is our planet, and our health depends on how we value and relate to natural ecosystems. One thing that kept coming up in the case studies again and again was this constant knowing that people who are, on the ground, young people, refugee young people, women and so on, they understand it's not atomized. They understand their lives are dependent on roots and branches system. So things are very much interconnected, and that we need to consider the root causes of problems and not just treat one thing. So I think this is applicable whether you're a psychologist or whether you're a medical doctor. It's important, or a cultural studies person like me, it's important that we consider what is at the root cause, not just treat the symptom. And that's important in terms of being an individual, it's important in terms of our communities, and it's important in terms of our planet. I think I've made the point clearly that in well-being there is both life-giving and destructive forces involved, and that we need to look at both. Well-being as attainment is false. Homeostasis may be the goal, that means balance may be the goal, but we are always moving away or moving towards. Very rarely do we get that perfect homeostasis. So why do we try and model our well-being like that? Yes, it may be easier to understand, but it's not representative. It doesn't offer us a roadmap or a pathway in how to live well-being. I think effects on well-being and health are both unpredictable and interconnected. So once again, we cannot in our modelling just assume how things are going to go. We need to understand that and help people who are wanting to live well to understand that, life living is unpredictable and that it's interconnected. I think I've covered the other things previously, but creativity is really important because it helps people to see and imagine new ways of seeing a problem and new ways of seeing a solution. So one place to start there is stories and art. It's important to invest in our creative system. And I'm not just talking about painting or dance that we add on to a mental health unit or that we use with seniors. I'm actually talking about valuing art and culture as much as we value physical exercise, because of the skills and because of the perspectives and because of the connectedness that it actually brings, and also the kind of creative activities and creative cultural practices that I would consider and that I've seen is not limited, as I said, to dancing, to painting, to theatre, although they're critical. It's also gardening, surfing, walking, chatting with somebody. These are the creative cultural practices that we use. I'd like to thank you for listening to my presentation. There's clearly a lot to unpack, and it's really challenging doing that, when you're a one-way street here and I don't have an audience in front of me. I've popped down just a couple of dot points here to see if you're interested in this kind of approach to well-being. These are some of the possibilities of where you might start. It's not an ending in itself, it is just a beginning. Thank you for listening. I really look forward to your feedback, and I'll be very glad to have a conversation with you and think about where this paradigm might work or where it might not work. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.